Accepted. There's no new. Oh, actually, there is a good new sitcom. But equity can be a little bit more complicated than that. Oh,
I have to wear this for the video. Hello and welcome back to Monetize Me. My name is Jay.
And my name is Mac.
So one of the concepts that can be a bit hard to fully grasp is equity. Equity serves a lot of key purposes in a company, but it can often be misunderstood or even misused. So first off, what is equity?
Yeah, so the actual definition of equity is the value that will be returned back to the shareholders in the case of a company being liquidated. And the calculation is you take the assets of the company and you subtract from them all the liabilities. This can be outstanding debts or any other liabilities that the company has. There's another scenario where equity comes into play, or the definition of equity comes into play, and that's when a company gets acquired. And in that case, the calculation is slightly different, where it's the assets minus the liabilities that have not transferred to the new company. In day-to-day conversation, equity usually refers to the amount of ownership that a shareholder has of a company, right? So you can think of stocks or any other security that pertain to an ownership of a company. And that's usually what is meant by equity.
Okay. And another term that you'll often hear, especially in the entrepreneurial world or the startup area, less so when you're talking about investing in securities, like you mentioned at the end. But often when you hear equity, you hear vesting. Whether that is like an employee, you're looking for a new job and they mention vesting, or you hear around founders or investors. Vesting is basically a concept that is deferred equity. It is equity that you don't get right now. You get if you stay a certain number of years with the company. You get X% of the company or X number of shares over the next X number of years. So the reason for this is you don't just want someone to be able to take off with a huge amount of shares for not doing anything. So this prevents any shareholders from running off with equity without returning adequate value to the company. So usually you give equity a lot of the times in the beginning in return for value. You need that value and you don't have a lot of capital, so you give them equity instead. If you don't vest it, then they can leave very quickly without providing enough value back to the company to where it's worth that amount. And so vesting is a way to reward good behavior. And you'll often hear the word cliff also associated with this, where after a certain number of time or a certain amount of time, you get to start vesting. So you can't vest up until that point, and then at that point, all of your previously vested shares are now yours, and you can start vesting over the next X number of years. So for example, 25% equity vested over 4 years with a 1-year cliff would mean that no equity is granted to that person if they leave before a year. That 1-year cliff means that until they get to their first year with the company, they get nothing. And then after that first year, they get a quarter, because there's 4 years, they get 1/4 of their total vesting shares, which would be 6.25%. They would get that immediately. And then over the next 3 years, which is the rest of the vesting period, they would then accrue the rest of the equity. Whether that's by month or by quarter, it kind of varies case by case. But this is a way of ensuring that you're rewarding people for putting in time and putting in effort into your company. And you're also decentivizing people coming just for equity and then leaving. So people can't just come in, get equity, and leave your company. And founders can't just start a startup and then leave after a couple months and take a big portion of the company with them. They have to be there for a certain amount of time.
Yeah, so the vesting really protects the original equity of the company, especially in its early days, which is why vesting is very important when you talk about founders' equity. But it's also used in employees' equity. But who is equity really for? When we talk about equity, who gets this equity, right? So we can think of investors, venture capitalists, angel investors. You can think of founders. You can think of employees. You can even think of people who've just kind of done a project for the company, like like a consultant, right?
Or contractor.
And all these people kind of will sometimes be rewarded with equity, especially in the early stages of a startup. And the idea is either you don't have the capital to fully pay them for their services, or you just have you want to incentivize them to work harder. So a lot of startups will offer their employees equity because they want them to be part of the team. They want them to help grow the company with the rest of the founders, right? With the C-level. And that gives them the incentive to work harder because they have a stake in the company.
Yeah. Not only that, but sometimes smaller companies, it's really hard to compete with Google and Facebook and some of the really large Fortune 500 companies that can offer like this expansive benefits package and a 401k match and a huge salary and bonuses. Sometimes a startup can't afford to do that, so they give you equity instead, saying, hey, if you're here for a long period of time and you are putting in your effort and we do well, you can make a lot of money off of the equity we're giving you because we can't afford to give you a lot of these benefits right now. So we're going to give you this number of shares or this percentage of the company, and then down the line, if we get acquired or if we go public, you can then liquidate that, and you have a pretty nice chunk of change when it's all said and done. But you do have to stick with the company in order to see that through.
Yeah. So this is just kind of like an introduction to our episodes about equity. We have a couple planned, including we talked about vesting. We'll expand more about vesting. We'll expand more about how do we divide up equity among founders.
Yep,
right?
absolutely.
Who should get more? Who should get less? Should everybody get the same?
Yeah, and why founders' equity is a bit different than every other equity or other equity types, like whether you're an employer or investor. Founder equity dilutes, and we'll go more in detail on that, as well as anything else pertaining to equity that we think is a bit complicated and we want to simplify and communicate so that it's less daunting.
Yeah, and the idea is just to kind of break down this concept of equity, which a lot of people who start startups don't really understand / don't prioritize.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about why you should prioritize equity in the beginning, why you should prioritize talking about your co-founders, talking with your co-founders about how to do an equity split and what each person should get, what kind of equity should each person get.
And what's a plan for?
Yeah. So if you have any suggestions for episodes within the equity topic, leave them in the comments.
Yeah. Or any questions about this video, even though it was brief. If you have anything specific you want to point out, let us know. And we'll see you next time.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Like, comment, subscribe.
Good night.
I feel like it was very
8 minutes.
Yeah.
Really short, sweet. We don't need 15 minutes for that.